Hello world, I am your host Dr. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐡 𝐅𝐨𝐫. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work here in London. So as you might know if you've heard the news, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, died very recently. It was in fact the 13th of November 2020. So he was convicted of murdering 13 women and also the attempted murder of another 7 women. Most of these occurred in Yorkshire, and he preyed on prostitutes as he viewed them as vulnerable. They worked alone, they worked mainly at night. What's interesting about this case is that Sutcliffe initially went to prison, but he was later transferred to Broadmoor, which is a high secure hospital under the Mental Health Act. There are many aspects of this case that are related directly to my area of expertise as a forensic psychiatrist. For example, he attempted to get a finding of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility instead of murder. And he was actually diagnosed by 4 separate forensic psychiatrists as having paranoid schizophrenia. And then eventually he did go to Broadmoor. And that is why I've made this video for you beautiful people. I'm going to dissect these issues and many more for you later on in this episode. Sutcliffe's murders occurred from 1969 to 1980. He even committed his last 2 murders whilst he was awaiting trial after being arrested for drunk driving. And these murders were brutal, man. They included bludgeoning a prostitute to death with a hammer, and also some of his actions were bizarre to say the least, including stuffing horsehair into the mouth of one particular victim. So Sutcliffe was arrested in January 1981 whilst he was driving a car with a 24-year-old prostitute because the car had a false number plate. I suppose the woman inside must have had no idea how lucky she was that that car was stopped. And the very next day, the police returned to the scene of the arrest with Sutcliffe and they discovered a knife, a hammer and some rope. And amazingly, Sutcliffe even managed to give them the slip just for a couple of hours because he pretended that he was bursting for a pee. During his trial, Sutcliffe tried his best to get his 13 murder charges downgraded to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that defence later on in this video. Sutcliffe claimed that he was psychotic and that he was the tool of God, and he said that he was hearing these voices that were ordering him to kill prostitutes and that these voices were the voice of God. 4 individual forensic psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but yet the judge rejected this and demanded that he had a full trial with a full jury. There's a suggestion that the reason that the judge rebuffed the psychiatrist's opinions was that he was influenced by the evidence of a prison officer who overheard Sutcliffe speaking to his wife, saying that if he could convince people he was mad, he might get off with 10 years in a loony bin. Sutcliffe was initially given a minimum term of 30 years to be served in prison before parole could even be considered, though this was later changed in 2010 to a whole life tariff, which, as it sounds, means that you spend your whole life in prison. There's only a very small group of prisoners that have been given this, and he belongs to that group. After his trial, Sutcliffe admitted to 2 other attacks. However, these were not prosecuted as it was not deemed to be in the public's best interest, which, to be fair, must have been fairly upsetting for the families of those victims. The West Yorkshire police were criticised for a number of reasons. One of them was that they had actually interviewed Sutcliffe 9 times in the past, but that information was stored in paper, making it difficult to cross-reference, which may have led them off the trail. In addition, the police were criticised for being too focused on hoax confessional tapes and also going after the wrong suspect. And they ignored advice not only from the survivors of Sutcliffe's attacks, but also from the FBI. Sutcliffe began his sentence at HMP Parkhurst in May 1981, and he was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in prison, although initial attempts to send him to a secure unit were blocked. During this time, Sutcliffe was attacked and seriously assaulted in the hospital wing at Parkhurst Prison, and there was a broken coffee jar was plunged into his face twice in the side of his face, and he ended up needing 30 stitches. In March 1984, Sutcliffe was transferred to Broadmoor High Secure Hospital, and this is exactly the type of case that forensic psychiatrists such as myself would oversee, and I've actually worked at Broadmoor Hospital for a relatively brief period of time when I was a junior psychiatrist. Sutcliffe was again attacked in his bedroom in Broadmoor, and the assailant attempted to strangle him with headphone cables. And then during another attack in 1997, Sutcliffe lost the vision in his left eye, and his right eye was seriously damaged. And then he was attacked again a further time in Broadmoor in 2007 by a patient, and this man attempted to stab his other eye, though he missed and he just got Sutcliffe's cheek. Sutcliffe was deemed to be fit to leave Broadmoor and to go back to prison as early as 2009, although there was quite a lot of resistance for this happening. So he was transferred from Broadmoor to Franklin Prison in August 2016, and he remained there until the day that he died, which is just past 13th November. And his death appears to be related to COVID symptoms. So I want to deep dive on a few issues here that are relevant to my area of expertise and inform you lovely people using my experience of working as a forensic psychiatrist. But first, I'd like to very quickly big up this channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. Stick around, it'll literally take less than 1 minute. I'm sure you're busy, everyone's busy, but you're not that busy. So are you interested in true crime? Are you interested in mental illness? Well, why not both? Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds, the only YouTube series which addresses the crossroads, the intersection of the two. I'm your host, Dr. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡 𝐅𝐨𝐫 I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist, and I live and work in London. I spend my time assessing and rehabilitating mentally disordered offenders so you don't have to. I work in prisons, in courts, and in secure psychiatric units like Broadmoor, and I also act as an expert witness to advise judges during criminal trials all across the UK. This channel that you're watching, A Psych for Sore Minds, dissects a whole range of mental health topics. Some are related to offending and violence, and some are more, should we say, familiar to the average person. These fascinating, educational, and at times inspiring videos are a random and eclectic mix, from outlining different diagnoses and symptoms and seeing how they fit together, to dissecting high-profile criminal cases related to mental illness, like this one, to critiquing the depictions of psychiatric patients on TV. Some episodes are interviews with real people who have suffered from actual mental illnesses, and together we dissect how it's affected their lives and also reveal how they got better, how they recovered, what support worked and what didn't. So basically this channel has something for everybody. I've got hundreds of fascinating cases that I've personally assessed, diagnoses like schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and various personality disorders. Other podcasts and YouTube channels talk about it. I've seen it, I've assessed it, I've diagnosed it, and I've treated it. I'm also quite happy to take any of your questions related to mental health. So I would like you to make A Psych for Sore Minds your one-stop shop for information about mental health issues. Okay, so the first question is, what exactly is diminished responsibility? I feel I can answer this because I've personally given evidence about this, including murder cases at the Old Bailey. So diminished responsibility changes murder and it downgrades it to manslaughter. It's a partial psychiatric defence, so it's not a full defence that completely exonerates the defendant. So murder carries a mandatory life sentence, whereas manslaughter is the sentencing is up to the judge, it's at their discretion. So the judge still could potentially choose life imprisonment, or they could even release the defendant, or anything in between. The only time that I've ever seen a judge release a defendant has been in the context of battered wife syndrome, where a woman, well, it could technically be a man, but I've only ever seen it with women, where they've been abused for many years and eventually they lash out and they kill their spouse. To summarise the legal criteria for diminished responsibility, the defendant has to be suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning, which arose from a recognised medical condition, and it's substantially impaired the defendant's ability to do one of three things, which are understand the nature of their conduct, form a rational judgment, and exercise self-control. So if Sutcliffe was truly hearing voices, and he said that he heard the voice of God ordering him to kill prostitutes, you could argue, well, specifically a barrister could argue on the evidence of a forensic psychiatrist, that Sutcliffe was unable to form a rational judgment. So my next question is, can the court ignore the evidence of 4 psychiatrists? Well, the answer is clearly yes, because that's what happened in this case. At the risk of sounding smug, it does appear that the psychiatrists are actually correct, because Sutcliffe was diagnosed later again with paranoid schizophrenia, and he did end up going to Broadmoor. I'd just like to say that going to Broadmoor, being transferred to hospital, is not necessarily an easy option for defendants, as some people might assume. I think it's a common misconception. The conditions of Broadmoor are extremely high security, and patients, because they're technically patients, they're not prisoners, they have a high level of restriction. It's not too dissimilar to prison. So as expert witnesses, we give our opinions to the court on psychiatric issues, but it's completely up to the court to ignore our evidence. I'd have to say it's very unusual for the court to ignore multiple psychiatrists who have the same view. What usually happens is that different psychiatrists have different views, especially if it's a complicated case or a high profile case, or if there are contentious issues, and especially if the psychiatrists are working for different sides. So you've got one for the defence, one for the prosecution, even though the psychiatrist should actually be completely impartial and not act for whichever side instructs them, which is also ultimately the side that pays them. However, what's unusual in this case is that all four psychiatrists are saying the same thing, and the court has still ignored them. And it's prerogative, it's allowed to ignore them. But as a forensic psychiatrist myself, being a bit cynical, I have to ask the question, why did they bother even getting expert evidence if clearly it had made up its own decision? So my next question would be, are patients released from Broadmoor or from similar high secure hospitals? And the answer is definitely yes. It's basically up to the forensic psychiatrists that treat them when they can leave, when they're discharged in the community. And if they have extremely high risk patients, so people that are very high profile or have committed multiple murders, as in the case of the Yorkshire Ripper, then I think it's very unlikely that the forensic psychiatrist will ever deem them to be completely safe to be released in the community. Notice I didn't say impossible, I said it's very unlikely. Another situation might be where there's somebody with a mental illness that is so untreatable, so intractable, that despite the psychiatrist's attempts of using lots of different medication, the symptoms just don't go. And so these people are not likely to leave hospital. So in that scenario, it's not the seriousness of the index offence. Say, for example, they've committed one murder. You have to have committed something very serious to be in Broadmoor in the first place. But if they weren't extremely high risk, like a multiple murderer, that's one scenario where they might never leave hospital. I've certainly dealt with patients when I worked at Broadmoor that, unless a miracle happens, I don't see them ever leaving hospital. The ethos of all secure psychiatric units is treatment and rehabilitation. It's not punishment. And a large majority of patients that will go to high secure hospitals like Broadmoor will eventually be deemed safe enough to go into the community. Again, it's not as high profile, as dangerous as the Yorkshire Ripper, but other ones. And that's if they've been settled for many years. And obviously this involves a high amount of rehabilitation, medication, occupational therapy, psychological rehabilitation, and leave. So they have leave testing, first escorted, then unescorted. Occasionally patients are released directly from Broadmoor into the community if they get better quite quickly, although it's far more common for them to step down to like a medium secure unit. And also they tend to be followed up in the community by psychiatrists who keep an eye on their mental health, make sure there's no emerging symptoms of mental illness, and also constantly evaluate their overall level of risk. There are 4 high secure psychiatric hospitals within the UK, and they are Broadmoor, Ashworth and Rampton, all in England, and also Carstairs, which is in Scotland. In fact, when I was a medical student at Edinburgh University, I visited Carstairs many years ago. I'd love to do eventually another video describing what it's like to work in a high secure unit and the extra levels of security that are needed to deal with the most violent and dangerous patients of all of forensic psychiatry. And I'd also like to do a video about how easy or not it is to fake mental illness, because that was one of the concerns for the Yorkshire Ripper. I could talk for hours about this, and there's not enough time to go into it for this podcast. So the final question that I'd like to address for you today is this: do prisoners and patients get assaulted in these kinds of institutes? I wouldn't say it was common from my experience, but it definitely happens, and that's because there's like a criminal hierarchy, like a code. So for example, paedophiles, rapists, or murderers of women and children specifically tend to be at the bottom of this hierarchy, and they quite frequently are assaulted, bullied, beaten up, even killed. So Sutcliffe, because of the nature of his crime, murdering 13 women, definitely would have been a target. So I've mentioned Crimecon UK a few times in previous videos. It's going to be happening next year in June 2021 in London. I'm going to be there. I'll be doing a talk. I'd love to see some of you guys there. Another person that's going to be there is John Sweeney, a renowned reporter, and he's got a brand new podcast out called Hunting Ghislaine Maxwell.
Remember this nutter?
You were not there at the beginning of that interview! You were...
That was me, John Sweeney, at my diplomatic best with the Church of Scientology. I'm back, this time investigating Ghislaine Maxwell. She denies supplying underage sex slaves for a super-rich American paedophile, Jeffrey Epstein. Ghislaine has powerful friends, Presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump.
I just wish her well, frankly.
And someone closer to home. Prince Andrew denies ever having met one of Ghislaine's alleged sex slaves, but can't explain the photo of the two of them together. Listen on Global Player or wherever you find your podcasts to Hunting Ghislaine, a global original podcast.
Ghislaine Maxwell, I'm sure you've heard of her, is the daughter of a disgraced billionaire and the former partner of a super rich paedophile who killed himself whilst he was awaiting trial for sex trafficking. After hiding for almost a year, she now finds herself facing multiple charges for helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually exploit and abuse underage women, so it's really shocking stuff. And this could lead to her spending the rest of her life in jail. In this new podcast series, Hunting Ghislaine, reporter John Sweeney investigates a fairy story which kind of happened the wrong way round, of how a princess ends up being accused of being a monster and no one at all ends up happily ever after. The first episode is available on the 19th of November. And if you'd like to dig a little deeper, then you can find out more from John Sweeney himself when he joins us at Crimecon UK next year to share more, and I'll be there as well. So please subscribe to our channel. Not only does it help me out more than you'll ever know, but it actually makes you more attractive to the opposite sex, or same sex, whatever. I'm not here to judge. So please, listeners, can you comment on the YouTube video? I'll be really grateful. So we're getting a decent amount of views, I think, considering how new we are, but I'd really like to generate more discussion and comments. I'll go on there myself, respond to any comments or any questions. And as well as that, please follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and submit episode ideas or questions to our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. I'd be grateful if you tell your favourite people about A Psych for Sore Minds, because come on, let's face it, they deserve it. Anyway, that's enough from me. Enjoy the rest of your day, and until next time, stay euthymic, homies.